Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hard Truth with myself, David Vance, and Alana Mercer. Hi, Alana.
Hi, David, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget to subscribe and share.
That's absolutely right. Now, listen. We took a little April break, I suppose, on Hard Truth, but we are back with a vengeance, Alana, and we've got lots of issues to tackle in the weeks ahead. So, just to re-emphasize the point, if you enjoy all of this, you've got to make sure you hit the subscribe button, guys, and you've got to make sure you hit the share button as well, because that means that we then get the message out to as many people as is possible. So I hope you'll do that for us both. So
today we have a very special guest, and his name is Dr. Boyd CATHEY. He earned his master's degree at the University of Virginia as a Thomas Jefferson Fellow. He has a doctorate in political philosophy and history from the University of Navarra in Spain. He did additional studies in theology and philosophy in Switzerland, and he retired from his position as State Registrar of the North Carolina State Archives. He's a Southern patriot, and so you'll find his work on the Abbeville Institute's site, Confederate Veteran magazine, and the Remnant, as well as his largest platform is the UN's Review. So let's welcome Boyd CATHEY.
Great. Hello there, Boyd.
Hi there.
Good to see you, Boyd, and thanks for joining us on the stream. So, Alana, do you want to set up the article that we want to talk about? Boyd's article?
First, I wanted to ask Boyd about one piece he wrote about zombification of America. Remember that? And you quote W.B. Yeats there, which was fascinating to me because you speak of one sentence, the best lack all conviction. And that sort of resonated with intensity. And you say, it is no longer a situation where our leaders or the best lack conviction, but they are actually becoming enemies of civilization. And I was wondering, I wanted to challenge you on that. Do you think we are really governed by the best, or is what we're seeing really a sort of instantiation of an evil, ignorant idiocracy? I mean, haven't the moral and intellectual standards, institutional rot governs our institutions, and the moral and intellectual standards have been thoroughly inverted? So I wonder what you say about, are we governed by the best?
No, we're not. I think I may say in that article, or perhaps in another one, that this process began long ago. It began in earnest after World War II, I think, with the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe, and what I would call the Americanization in a pejorative way of Western Europe. And it has also happened apace in the United States, in particular for the last 30 years. I mean, you see an ever-changing censorship where certain things which are okay to say or words okay to use one year become impossible to say, on the order de bas, if you will, the next year. And I think what you've got is what Sam Francis, the late Sam Francis, and before him James Burnham talked about, and that is the growing managerial bureaucracy elites, which don't change. They're self-perpetuating, and their power has grown considerably since the Roosevelt period. I mean, it actually, you can trace it back to, I think I mentioned Colonel House in World War I, a kind of globalism, a vision of a world which would be ruled by certain elites. And I think I have friends who have worked in Washington, for example, and have seen it firsthand. And there's an incomprehension on the part of a number of these people because they don't mix with what I would call regular people. They don't mix with people who grow up with traditions and family and, a normal rhythm of life. They work 5 days a week and go to church on Sunday. What you've got is this particular process, I think, really got going about 20 or 30 years ago. And what happened with the Trump election was, and again, there are many criticisms that can be made of Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah.
In particular, some of the appointments he made, which were abysmal.
Oh, yeah.
But the very fact that he did not fit in the mold, he was not a member of the establishment like George W. Bush and Clinton and Obama and the Republican candidates for president, who were also abysmal. It upset the establishment. And I think what they did was step up their timetable. In other words, the progressive conversion of the United States and Western Europe accelerated. And when I use the term that Yeats used in his poem, The Second Coming from 1919, I think in a certain sense, he may not have seen exactly what we have going on today, but I do think he understood that the parameters, the limits were there, and that it could well develop that way. The destruction of Metternich's Concert of Europe in 1918 destroyed a balance. It wasn't a perfect balance, but it was basically a balance without world war.
Yeah.
It was a balance of...
You speak about Boyd, you speak about that's very interesting. You cite our friend Paul Gottfried, who's no doubt the foremost scholar on the European and American right. And you speak about particularly Germany, and we have arrived at an illiberal position whereby public and private speech have become subject to law, governed by law now. And so you do link it back to the Marshall Plan and to the denazification in 1945. And that is that issues from America. Can you link that to what you've just been saying?
I was assistant to Russell Kirk, the late Dr. Russell Kirk, in 1970-71. And while I was there, I read a volume. The name of the author right now escapes me. You may remember it. A German writer who commented about the denazification program and the fact that in France and Germany and Italy, essentially no traditional or conservative philosophy was permitted. The major opposition party in France up until de Gaulle was the MRF, the Mouvement Républicain Français, which is not really conservative. And the Christian Democrats under Konrad Adenauer, at least ostensibly, started out to be a fairly conservative party, but there were limitations and parameters about which they could not go beyond. And I think with Kissinger and certainly with the later German prime minister presence, Germany has become a cesspool of wokeness, if I can use a terminology. I mean, let me give you a case example. In several states in Germany now, you cannot use the Z sign because that is a symbol used by the Russians who've invaded Ukraine. And if you do that, you're liable to be fined or even sent to jail. Free expression doesn't exist in Germany. I'm a fan of classical music and opera, for example, and I'm sure ILANA knows that. The director of the Munich Philharmonic, Valery Gergiev, who is a Russian conductor, very famous, who's done all sorts of things. He also happens to be ethnically Ossetian and very pro-Russia. He was fired from his position at Munich because he would not denounce his own country. It wasn't a question of keep quiet. He had to publicly denounce it or he would be fired. He was fired. These are just minor examples. Well, you mentioned Paul Gottfried. He's done quite a bit of work on what's going on in Europe.
Yes.
And by the way, this process is not going on as fast or even at all in parts of Eastern Europe. And I've talked to Paul Gottfried about this. I think our belief is that actually communism acted as a kind of a prophylaxis over Eastern Europe, protecting it from the worst aspects of American foreign policy and Americanism, the bad aspects.
Yes. That's what interests me, Boyd, is that
like Poland and Hungary escape, and they are much more traditional or conservative now, because in a sense they were frozen in stasis in 1945 or 1940, whichever date.
Yeah.
And so when the veil of communism was taken off, you have the reemergence of these traditions and these philosophies that had been somewhat dormant for 40 or 50 years. And I think you can make a case that that's the reason that I have a dear friend who's a Serbian PhD. He's visiting his homeland right now. Serbia is fairly conservative, fairly traditional. Slovakia is, Poland is, Russia is. So I think you can make a case that in some ironic way, Soviet communism, acting as a prophylaxis, prevented the worst excesses of American commercialism and thinking from destroying it. I did my graduate work, a part of my graduate work in Spain, and I've received my PhD there in 1975. And I remember having arguments with Spanish students who wanted all this American culture. And I said, why would you give up your culture, which dates back to the Reconquista? Why would you give that up in favor of this tawdry Americanism, being able to drive a Ford car and watch some stupid American TV program when you have this very rich culture that is your own?
Boyd, what you call what you call in your column the culturally and racially and sexually decadent West, now which hasn't really taken hold in Hungary, and you say in Russia, but certainly Ukraine looks very much like Russia, and it's certainly demographically, and Hungary. Yet there seems to be a sea change in the understanding of the people of their culture. How do you explain that? There's something different about Ukraine when you compare it to Hungary and Russia.
I have a number of books, writers that I've consulted on this. I've been interested in Russia ever since I was in Spain. And I was in school with the granddaughter, in graduate school with the granddaughter of a Russian exile who left Russia in 1920. And she advised me to start reading certain things. My Russian is not very good. My French is much better, so I was able to read a lot of it either in French or Spanish and some in English. But Ukraine is a very special case. If you look at the ethnological history of the country, I mean, Russian language actually is spoken by a majority of the people. Ethnically, I would say possibly 20% is Russian, and they're concentrated in the Donbass area, the Lugansk and Donetsk area, and of course Crimea, which was Russian, completely Russian up until 1954. And, Khrushchev, apparently in a drunken fit one evening, tore it away from Russia and gave it to Ukraine, which is where he was from. And the areas around Kherson and Odessa traditionally are Russian speaking. And there's an excellent book. In fact, I brought it along with me today. It's by a Polish historian. Let's see if I've got it here. Frontline Ukraine Crisis in the Borderlands of Europe by Richard Sakwa. He's written a number of studies, and I would put him in the same category with the late Stephen Cohen. It's a cautionary tale. It was written right after the 2014 American-sponsored and engineered coup, which overthrew a popularly elected Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, and put in a hand-picked American. I'm sure we've all heard the stories of how Victoria Nuland was picked up,
yes,
I think, in Estonia, when she said, "Yats is the man, Yatsenia."
yes.
Basically, what happened then was the United States and had been expanding, or actually NATO had been expanding against what George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker had promised Yeltsin that they would do. Remember Secretary Baker telling Yeltsin, NATO will not advance 1 inch more to the east.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
There's no reason for it to. There's no reason for a armed NATO to exist. The Soviet Union had disappeared. There were, 18, 19 Russian republics. Well, they were different republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all these other places. But unfortunately, during the Clinton administration and on following rapidly in the Bush administration and Obama and on, you've had this incentivized advance. And just the other day, you had Secretary Blinken and
Pelosi.
Exactly, in Kiev, and they were saying the object of the war we're involved in, the implicitly, is not to really help the Ukrainian people,
but to bleed, as you put it, bleed Russia dry.
Russia. And obviously the result of that would be regime change and put on our man like Navalny or someone like that.
Yes.
So we'll fight this war till the death of every Ukrainian, if that's what it takes to weaken Russia. And it was an admission that a lot of us have been saying for a long time. Anybody who reads the various histories, and I've got some here, Alan Lynch, who's a professor at the University of Virginia that I know, Sakwa, Richard Cohen. There's also this volume here. Let's see if I can bring it. It's a series of interviews that Vladimir Putin did several years ago.
With
First Person.
Yeah, Oliver Stone.
And and then of course the Oliver Stone. Russia did this. Russia started out thinking, we've completely divided our country. The Soviet Union no longer exists. We've got all these little separate republics now. Many of them, like Kazakhstan, have large numbers of Russians living in these places. And Russia says, well, look, we've destroyed the Warsaw Pact. There now really is no reason for NATO. And if you're going to have NATO, maybe we could join it. In fact, at one time, there was this idea, we'll make a giant, big NATO, but we would like to be partners. In other words, we don't want to be we don't want to be satraps. Exactly. We don't want to be second-rate people. We're the largest country in the world, we've got 150 million people. We would like to be a partner. And each time, the foreign policy establishment, the neoconservatives and their friends, for different reasons, said no. I mean, look at the Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and 2. Yeah. The Ukrainians were sort of prepared to accept those, which would have settled the problem, essentially, of the Donbass. It would have given the Russians the right to use their own language, which they really don't have now. They can't do it in commerce. They can't do it, the newspapers have been suppressed. The radio stations and television stations have been suppressed. They were suppressed before the Russian incursion. And who pulled the strings and said no? The United States. The United States.
Yes.
And
So don't you find, if I can just ask you this, Boyd, don't you find that our presence there, our geopolitical presence there, and the promise, even implicit, of course, we are arming the Ukrainians, but the promise of us sort of interfering with this geopolitical ecosystem has prevented this idiot Zelensky, the toast of the town, from, generating high-level diplomacy with Putin. And it's just stringing him along. And as you say, the victims in this are the Ukrainians.
I think you're essentially correct, Ilana. Zelensky was elected as a reformist, as a populist reformist. He also happened to be an American pick and a friend of Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum. One of the first things he did was apply for EU membership, and they never took NATO off the table. But put yourself in the Kremlin and look at what has happened. You've got NATO troops in Norway. You've got the 3 Baltic states now, which are NATO. You've got Poland, Romania, Turkey. You've got Georgia, which is not a member of NATO, but obviously not partial to Russia. And then you go around on the other side as well, Alaska. Russia felt encircled.
Yes.
And it's not a question of communism. I mean, there's this myth that
that's ridiculous.
That Putin says, I want to reconstitute the Soviet Union. That's not what he said. If you read his interview, what he said was that economically, because his dissertation at Leningrad University was international trade and economics. That was his forte. But he says, what happened was you've broken apart a nation. And it goes way beyond communism, way back to Catherine the Great. Most of these areas were assembled in the 18th century. Economically interdependent areas. Kazakhstan. I mean, you've got the Trans-Siberian Railway going through Kazakhstan. What you've done is you've broken this up economically, and that is not a good thing. You've also taken away millions of native Russians who always thought of themselves as Russians and dropped them into other countries that are not Russia, that are, at least technically speaking, independent. And so his comment about that has been misconstrued. If you watch Fox News, you're going to see that repeated. Yeah. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. That is not correct. It's not what he said.
That's the trite neoconservative post-Cold War, narrative that they have no insight into what all the things you are saying. Putin, just listening to his interviews with Oliver Stone, there's no doubt he's deeply knowledgeable, as well as what you say about capitalism, and has no lost love for communism, no aspirations in that direction. But you and I, lovers of Tsarist Russian culture, Boyd, Tchaikovsky Pathetique, is there anything more sublime? Number 6. Number 6.
I have my favorites.
I won't forgive a no on that.
Watching a Tony Palmer film the other day on Rachmaninoff, and
I'd say Tchaikovsky number 6.
The Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. But I'm a huge fan of Russian culture. As I said, I began because maybe I was dating this young lady, but anyway, that may have prejudiced me in a certain way.
That's a good incentive.
It was quite nice looking, if I recall. And I often wonder what happened to her. But anyway, she said, "Boyd, do you know the music of Mussorgsky?" And I said, "Well, I have Night on Ball Mountain." She said, No. I mean Boris Godunov, the opera. And I said, "Well, no." And we got some old LP records, and this was in Spain. So there's a record shop in Pamplona, and we purchased, I say we, she had the money and I had the interest. We purchased this recording of Boris Godunov. And Boris Godunov exists in 3 or 4 different versions. Mussorgsky left a very slimmed down version. Then Rimsky-Korsakov came in and flourished it out with all sorts of interesting things. And Shostakovich did a version. Anyway, you can get all three of them. But we got the version. It was a Rimsky-Korsakov version. And I still, when I came back to the States, I actually acquired a copy of it. But I said, her name was Evgenia. I said, Evgenia, I said, this is wonderful. She said, can you feel what goes on in this? I said, yes. She said, then I want you to try something else. I said, what's that? She said, Mussorgsky wrote a second opera, Kovanshchina. And I said, what does that mean? She said, it's hard to translate. It means the time of the Kovanshchina. It takes place during the early reign of Peter the Great, and it concerns his attempt to change some of the Orthodox services and the old believers, and they, in the end, they all gather together and commit. They burn themselves up. They commit suicide. I said, that sounds like a dreary piece of music. The drama.
Funereal.
Said,
Funereal.
it's absolutely wonderful. You need to see it, need to hear it. So I've tried. I finally found a place in Japan about 5 years ago that had a film that actually
Boy,
the Soviets.
you and I could go on forever about Tsarist
Oh, I
Russia.
know this is totally extraneous, but the
But
whole
the
thing
point
is
is, what I got from
Russian literature, Russian culture helps to, as an insight into what Russians think and why our policies are so wrong-headed.
But that's where I want to challenge
misunderstood.
you. I want to challenge you about our romanticism. You and I definitely harken back to those times. And Putin is no doubt, if you listen to him, highly erudite, highly intelligent, and has at the tips of his fingers this culture and this sensibility. But do you think we are projecting our sense of loss in terms of we no longer have that in the West, projecting that on the Russian people? Do you think Putin is just a remnant? Because when I speak at least to the cohort that is present in America, communism seemed to have, in people younger than us, have wiped out that affinity for that culture and left them with a hatred for communism, but with a sort of a crass emptiness. So they're very open, Russians are, to what the West offers, consumerism and sexual titillation. Do you think we are being romantic about Russia and Putin? And is he just one? He's like the Masada Hebrew standing there defending the realm,
There's a way to look at it from that perspective, but I don't want to create a demigod out of Russia and hold them up necessarily in opposition. But I do think that there is some of that. I think that Americans, if we look back at our own preparation, I mean, I grew up here in North Carolina. My mother was an English professor, very much into culture. I suppose I got some of it from her. But I remember reading Shakespeare in high school. We read Romeo and Juliet and Julius Caesar. And we thought nothing about it. I have grandnephews now. They don't know who Shakespeare is, and they're English majors. I find that remarkably sad and tragic. The
criminal?
one thing
How
about
criminal? How about criminal?
about
Criminal.
what
Criminal. That's criminal, because that's the greatest writer in the English language.
Well, I had one of my nephews who's a bright student. Anyway, he told me, he said, Uncle Boyd, he said, we've mentioned Shakespeare, but I didn't take that course. I said, what about your basic English courses? You're doing graduate work in English. He said, well, I had a chance to take that, but I decided not to. He said, we're reading American writers.
The
And I
color
said, you mean you
purple
can be an English,
on Oprah's list.
you can be an English major and completely opt out of Shakespeare? And
Yeah.
any, I said, I just found that inconceivable.
Inconceivable. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry, just to come in. You mentioned Shakespeare, obviously, born here in the United Kingdom. So it's interesting, Boyd and Ilana, because it's not just American students who aren't familiar with Shakespeare, but English students in England, in Stratford, would not necessarily be familiar with Shakespeare's work as well. Why is that? Because our culture is essentially burnt down, and it's been burnt down. And Boyd, I have a question for you. Because you mentioned earlier on, you're talking about Bretton Woods, post World War II, and all of that. I've got a theory. You tell me what you think of it. My theory is that the American Empire came to the fore in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And that American empire is collapsing at this point in time, as all empires do, rotten and corroded from within. What have you got to say about that?
I agree with you. I think there may be nuances to be made about how and when and where, but I certainly agree with you. I mean, and it's strange, it's ironic in the very expansion of it, as we see today in Eastern Europe, and the fact that we have 30 nations now combined to place sanctions on Russia. In that very essor is a certain decadence that we also feel here in America, and I think you may feel in England. How do we sustain what we've been doing? And I do think every empire has a finite point. The British Empire, I mean, you will make the point, I'm sure, that starting with which king of England, Charles I, Charles II, you have the evolution of a British Empire, and certainly the 19th century was a century of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. But after World War I, that empire slipped away, certainly with Winston Churchill, ironically. After World War II, it was extinguished.
Well, that's
America,
right,
I think,
yeah, because the British Empire had its run, and it did collapse. You're quite right, because of the costs, which were, interestingly enough, kind of imposed by America on the UK.
Yes. David, just to interject, let's bring this back to America, because this is the theme of Boyd's column that we wanted to discuss. The Marshall Plan, denazification, lack of speech, the conflation of fascism with heritage, European heritage. Yes, let's pursue the theme of America as the focus of this impetus, of this destruction.
Well, I mean, you talk. I mean, Boyd talks about, and Ilana, he talks about the denazification of Germany, but this is the same America, the same NATO anyway, which is currently fighting or supporting the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Well, there's a bit of an irony, isn't it? So we're going to denazify Germany, but we're going to support the Nazis in Ukraine. Explain, how does that one work, Boyd?
There is a the United States broadcasts its idealism and its principles. You get Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer going to Ukraine and talking about the defense of liberal democracy, and they are standing next to Volodymyr Zelensky. And yet, we don't have that idealism in our foreign policy. The more I study it, and the more I look at the history of it, a lot, maybe perhaps most of it, at least in concrete action, is not dictated by fealty to principles, unless those principles are somehow mechanistic and financial. It's power. And I think you see that in all of these different American-sponsored wars or invasions or incursions for the last 30 or 40 years, that when we go in, whether it be a color revolution, principle be damned. I mean, look what we're doing in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
On every channel, we proclaim Saint Volodymyr Zelensky is the champion of democracy. But what has he done? I'm going to refer to the gray zone for my example because it's not necessarily a right-wing site. He has suppressed 11 opposition television stations.
Really?
He has put the leaders of all the opposition parties in jail. There are assassination squads chasing people who disagree, who want to have peace, chasing them down. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So where is the idealism? Where are the ideals of liberal democracy, so-called? It's a facade. Look what Justin Trudeau did in Canada in the name of democracy. Look what's happening now about the Disinformation Governance Board.
Yeah, but just to come in on this one as well, Boyd. I mean, because I said this to ILANA before we were doing the show. I think the actual combination of words, liberal democracy, is essentially an oxymoron. One contradicts the other. What would you say with regard to that?
I totally agree with you, and you know, having cut my teeth, so to speak, with Russell Kirk, I got to know him when I was a college senior, a high school senior. I wrote him out of the blue, and we became fast friends, and he invited me to go be his assistant, and I read quite a bit while I was there. He had 40,000 books in his library, and I had lots of spare time.
I didn't know this about you, Boyd.
Excuse me?
I didn't know this about you, that you were so close to Russell Kirk.
Oh, yeah. My correspondence I donated. I have a collection at the University of North Carolina, all sorts of letters from him and to him. And we were very good friends. I got to meet all sorts of people there. I met Ray Bradbury, Eric Van Kunet-Ledeen, William Buckley, all sorts of interesting people that would come and stay at Mecosta. At his home.
I would have no yearning to meet William Buckley, but certainly Kirk is a big hero. This was Buckley back.
This was long before
neocon conservatism of National Review, before he threw out Joe Sobran, and before that.
This was 1970, 71.
Yeah,
71, 72.
But I was surprised, since we're veering, you are a national treasure, and that's why I think it's just so important to let you talk, because you can actually hold the stage with your knowledge and your experience. And we don't see people like you. Stephen Cohen died. Mearsheimer, Dr. Mearsheimer is never going to be on Tucker Carlson tonight. So it's so important to hear voices like yours who are vital. But yes, I think that Russell Kirk, there was, as a libertarian, a very conservative one, I was surprised at his strong stand on war. And that was quite interesting, reading through his books available. Maybe you know more about that. But
ILANA, have you read his book on Robert Taft?
No.
The Political Principles of Robert Taft?
No.
It is a full-throated endorsement of Robert Taft's America First principles.
Next on my reading list.
I think it's published by Fleet. I have an autographed copy here somewhere, but it doesn't get the kind of play. Russell condemned what he called Pax Americana. He said it is destined for a bitter, dirty death. I remember the lines. Back in the late 50s, he was saying that.
Yeah, but
it's interesting. Sorry, David, is to we've done this on this show. I think if you take Thomist just war theory, you might be able to justify Putin's war, because just war theory is somewhat more status than the libertarian axiom of non-aggression. But I think, I don't want to speak for you gentlemen, but I think we would be, my senses would be comfortable saying that Putin's war is a war for which there are plenty reasons, all of them vindicating Russia without exception. But a war of aggression has no justification, ultimately. And this is why I wonder, do you think this was a good move? And is he going to lose because this is a war of aggression?
My feeling is mixed in one respect. From a strategic point of view, I think Putin and the Russians felt they had been backed up into a corner from which there was no escape. The Donbass Russians were being persecuted, abused. The figure that most people accept is around 14,000 civilians were killed in one form or another, beginning in 2014. Zelensky had gone to the Munich Security Conference the week before the action, I think on the 24th, and said Ukraine has to renuclearize. They'd given their nuclear weapons up. We want to have nuclear weapons on our soil to protect us and potentially use against the Russians. There are all sorts of factors, but you put yourself in Putin's place. From his perspective, he'd reached the point, a red line, if you will, and he felt like he was backed up. Now, the only caveat I would make is that in going into Ukraine, which I think he could justify under any number of circumstances, and as you point out, under a scholastic point of view, in a sense, that's what the neocon managerial elites actually wanted. They wanted a long-range war to bleed Russia to death. This is why the operation to get munitions and armaments to Ukraine is taking such a long time. They could have all of those weapons in Ukraine in a matter of a few weeks.
Yes.
But they're taking their time because they want to bleed Russia to death. I mean, the words of Secretary Austin, we want Russia to be weak and never be able to emerge again. Charles Krauthammer, United States. We live in a unipolar world. This is the thesis. Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, 1998, was interviewed on his book. The book was Chessboard, I think it is. And he said the same thing. Russia will always be our enemy until it is brought low.
Yes.
Because it's a major problem.
This is something that Putin says, sadly, in his interview with Oliver Stone. He said it was doomed. We tried, but it was doomed. They were not going to treat us as a member of the common European nations. They were just not going to extend that courtesy to Russia. It was just doomed from the get-go. But do you think, to carry on, sorry, David, to carry on the theme, do you think Putin just stepped into this trap of being bled, so to speak?
I think it's hard to understand exactly what went through his mind. He's a very intelligent person. As you recall, back, I think it was 2013, he recommended 3 important Russian writers, Nikolai Berdyaev, Vladimir Soloviev, and Ivan Ilyin, for his top ministers and advisors to read. All 3 were strong Orthodox Russian Christians.
You mean he didn't recommend white fragility?
No. And his name is Kendi, didn't get recommended either. But he recommended these 3 writers. Actually, I had read Berdyaev and Soloviev because Eric von Kunet-Ledeen, who was a friend of mine, had recommended them. And if you go back to read his early work, Liberty or Equality, which I recommend highly, he talks about Berdyaev in Soloviev in a very spiritual sense of how they looked at the world. But they looked at the world just like Alexander Solzhenitsyn did. And Solzhenitsyn actually praised the vision that Putin had of attempting to draw these particular strands of history and culture together. Obviously, there's a period from 1919 until 1989, 90. You've got to deal with it. There's certain aspects of it, the Great War, certain things like that that have to be incorporated. But what does Putin do? One of the first things that he does, he reestablishes the Preobrazhensky Guard, and the uniforms they are wearing, if you'll notice, are the same uniforms they wore when they marched into Paris in 1815. They still do their drills. They are the Presidential Guard. They have been restored. Now, what is the symbol on the Russian seal? It is St. Andrew killing the dragon. These are symbolic, but what do they represent? Franklin Graham went to Russia about 10 years ago as part of the World Conference on Families. And he came back and gave a press conference. He said, I could not believe it. There are 24,000 new Christian churches that have been started in Russia since 1991, and many of them with government support. Now, I'm sure, Ilana, you might have friends. I have friends who say, oh, that's just a KGB plot. You can't believe any of that. It's just window dressing. But I'm of the view that the Old Testament, that God can speak through Balaam's ass if he so desires. And even if you go to church for the wrong reason.
Was a lovely donkey. Balaam was a lovely donkey.
If you put up a church and someone goes to it, that person may well find something of value there. Look, the thing that struck home to me was John McCain praising the group Pussy Riot, dancing, these lesbians dancing on the high altar of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Russia.
And Putin arrested them. Putin arrested them. And that was
horrible. That violated liberal democracy and freedom and all these wonderful things.
That was the work of the Lord. Yes, The Economist offered a very long and empty analysis about why most of the world, so it appears, has not joined in boycotting Russia. And did you hear that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said very succinctly, he said, that is because certain countries would never accept the global village under the command of the American sheriff. That was what Sergei Lavrov said.
India is a case example. You don't have to cite China. Look at India. Prime Minister Modi, I mean, he continues to have economic, commercial relations with Russia. He has refused the invitation, if you want to call it that, from the Americans and the EU and others to boycott Russia and Russian products. Hungary, Serbia, there are other countries, Brazil. Of the 130 countries in the world today, about 30 are engaged in a boycott. That means the majority are not boycotting Russia.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the fact is that if the objective is to create a unipolar world, under essentially NATO/American hegemony, it ain't going to work, Boyd, because there are all those other big countries. You mentioned India. Pakistan as well, smaller country, but nonetheless, although there's been, I think, a bit of a color coup there as well. Surprise, surprise. You've got China. You've got lots of countries which don't want to know about this at all. But I'll tell you what, we are coming to the end of our allocated time. But what I wanted to do, folks, is I just want to bring up on screen, if I can, Boyd's article that's been the basis of this, which is, here you go, The Illusion of Liberal Democracy, America's Long Record of Destruction Continues. So if people watching this want to read it for themselves, it's all here, and you can go there and enjoy that and the rest of Boyd's content as well on his website, which we will put below, so you can read all his thoughts. And I'm sure, Ilana, we could spend all evening talking about so many of the different elements and different things that he's touched upon. But
yes,
yeah.
Tucker Carlson could surely have Boyd on instead of some of his anointed thinkers.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Well, what I think is the purpose of this platform is to provide people with the chance to hear voices like Boyd's, so that, one of the things that irritates me is, a lot of people in the media talk about, we need to have a plurality of opinion. We need diversity. And the minute you try to put on conflicting and different opinions, you're going to be shut down, or ILANA not invited, or deplatformed. So no one gets deplatformed in this platform. So that's why it's been such a pleasure to have you on, Boyd. So if you just want to wrap it up, ILANA, then I think we'll bring things to a conclusion.
Yes, I did just want to ask Boyd to wrap it up with one mention. He does always pay homage to our boys, the innocent recruits to our they are not draftees. They volunteer army who go abroad to fight these battles that you mentioned. Alan Bloom, what's his name? The neoconservative Alan Bloom, yes, who actually put it quite frighteningly, the imposition of freedom and equality. He put it very honestly, much like Chucky Krauthammer used to. But we do have a military that has to go out and fight these wars. And I wanted to ask you, you said our boys are being sent to Ukraine also. But the more I think about it, aren't we also romanticizing our military? Hasn't it been fully transformed into this global force, down to the propagandized grunts, the recruits? You see their better graduates on Fox News, and they have very little affinity, Boyd, for the little platoons back home, and they are filled with this self-righteous zealotry. So the military, I mean, should we have this affinity for people who choose to fight these battles?
I'll give you one example very briefly. I have a good friend who went to West Point. He's retired. His grandson was accepted to West Point this past year. He was told that he had to undergo several weeks of racial sensitivity and sensitivity about sex. And after about 2 weeks, he called his father and said, "I can't take this." He said, "They're telling me," this is West Point, "they're telling me that there is no such thing as gender. It's entirely what you think it is at a certain time. They're telling me that my ancestors who came here in peonage as indentured servants were racist who mistreated and killed millions of Indians and mistreated Black folk."
At West Point.
At West Point. And he said, "I can't take it." And so he resigned. He left the academy and came back. And his dad called me and he says, "Well, where should I send him to school? What's a good place to go?"
Home.
And I said,
Homeschool.
There is no really great place. There are some schools, colleges that are better than others. I said, we could talk about it, but I said, there's just the contagion, the venom, if you will, has spread so thoroughly throughout academia that it's hard to recommend unreservedly a place. The other example, very briefly, did you see the ad that the U.S. military is presenting now? If you go check, you can check ad. It has this woman, and she says, "I am a lesbian. I come from a lesbian family. The Army welcomed me, and I'm here fighting for America and lesbian rights." And that's supposed to be a recruitment.
Yes. So I think the rot is systemic and the rot is institutional, and moral and intellectual standards have been utterly inverted, including in the military. And it's probably, at one point, the Navy had a slogan that was actually quickly cancelled about 10 years ago: global force for good. This was the
That's
Navy.
right.
That's right. So I think the military, you know, if men are going to go and fight these wars without any affinity for their own communities and borders, but to be fair, Boyd, the Anglo-Saxon man especially has this need to be a hero, has this need to be a rescuer. And this is so, on a psychological level, thwarted among young men. They would be maligned and molested were they to patrol their neighborhoods or go to the border. So this, like lunatic lemmings, they rush to Ukraine. So it's sad, but I think the tipping point is there.
There's a feminization and a discouragement, if not a suppression of masculinity. I cannot advise any relative of mine, any of my second cousins, to actually find a college unless they're so strong in their beliefs that they can resist what they do. I can't recommend they go to public schools. A lot of my friends now have family consortia where they educate their children or grandchildren in someone's home, and there's certain texts that they can use, but it's a remnant, if you will, ILANA. It's a remnant. I mean, we still have this idea that going to a good college or university is the key to success in our society. And yet the people who are turned out by these schools, and I don't want to use the word ignoramus, but they just don't have what it takes.
No.
It's what David was talking about. I think it's the end of the American century.
It's a good point. It's a good point to get back to the beginning. They are not what W.B. Yeats called the best. They are not.
No.
That we're not turning out the best. Absolutely the opposite of the best. Certainly a good topic to pursue next is education, because of the wealth of information. But we'll have to have book lists, provided you bring book lists, because I'm always in desperate need for reading matter.
ILANA, let me say something.
Robert Taft. I'm going to read the Taft book.
I've got Jasper over here now, and I'd like to show him. Jasper, come here. Come here.
This is the dog of the house.
Yes, he's going to get up in my lap.
A spaniel. Hello, Jasper. Oh, kissy.
This is my intellectual companion. I prefer his company to about 95% of the people that I know. He's extremely intelligent, very affectionate, and he's been called a white racist given his color. Anyway, he rejects that.
He loves the limelight. Okay, guys, it's been a pleasure.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you both. Good to see you too, ILANA, on the screen. Yes.
Lovely meeting you, Boyd. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.